You don't belong in first class. The ticket is clearly a mistake." Those were the last words the senior purser sneered at Dr. Vivian Clark before shoving her toward the back of the plane. He thought she was just another economy passenger trying to scam an upgrade. He didn't know she was the lead structural engineer who had redesigned the very turbine engines humming beneath their feet. He didn't know that a catastrophic failure was exactly 42 minutes away. And he certainly didn't know that the only person who could save his job and his life was the woman he'd just humiliated. Buckle up. This is the story of how arrogance almost crashed Flight 902 and the brutal karma that waited at the gate. The fluorescent lights of JFK's Terminal 4 hummed with that specific headache-inducing frequency known only to exhausted travelers. It was 6:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the air outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was bruising into a deep, stormy purple. Rain lashed against the glass, distorting the tail fins of the massive jets waiting on the tarmac. "Doctor!" Vivian Clark adjusted the strap of her worn leather satchel, her knuckles white as she gripped her boarding pass. She didn't look like the keynote speaker for the International Aerospace Safety Summit in London. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 3 weeks crawling inside the nacelles of 777s in the humid heat of a South Carolina testing facility. She wore a simple charcoal hoodie, loose joggers, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, frantic flyaways escaping around her temples. She just wanted to sleep. She had paid $6,000 of her own consulting fees for Seat 2A first class. Lie flat, with the noise-cancelling cocoon that would let her forget the stress fractures she'd been analyzing all week. Zone 1 boarding, the intercom crackled. "First class and Diamond Medallion members, you are welcome to board." Vivian stepped forward, the first in line. She moved with the tired efficiency of someone who lived in airports. She extended her phone, the QR code bright on the screen. The gate agent, a woman whose name tag read Tiffany, didn't even look at the screen. She looked at Vivian's hoodie, then she looked at Vivian's face, then she looked past her. "Zone 1, ma'am," Tiffany said, her voice dripping with a saccharine condescension that felt practiced. "We're boarding first class. General boarding is in 20 minutes. Please step aside." Vivian didn't move. She held the phone steadier. "I am Zone 1, Seat 2A. Tiffany sighed, a long, dramatic exhale that blew her bangs up. She finally snatched the phone from Vivian's hand, not scanning it, but staring at it as if looking for a forgery. She tapped her long acrylic nails on the podium counter. "The system is flagging a lot of errors today," Tiffany said loudly, performing for the line of business suits forming behind Vivian. "It happens when people try to manipulate the app upgrades." "I didn't manipulate anything," Vivian said, her voice low and calm. "I bought that ticket 3 weeks ago. Full fare." Tiffany typed something into her keyboard. "Well, Dr. Clark," she emphasized the title with a smirk, as if it were a nickname. "It looks like we have a seating conflict. Seat 2A is occupied." "Occupied by whom?" "I haven't boarded yet." "A priority partner. And since your fare class seems to be irregular, the system has reassigned you." Tiffany hit a button, and a small slip of paper printed out. She handed it to Vivian with a tight, shark-like smile. "Seat 34E. It's a middle seat in the rear cabin, but you'll still get to London. Lucky you." Vivian stared at the ticket. The blood began to thrum in her ears. It wasn't just the downgrade, it was the theft. "This is a $6,000 ticket. You cannot just move me to economy without a refund or a valid reason. Who is in my seat?" "Ma'am, you are holding up the line," Tiffany snapped, the customer service mask slipping. "If you continue to be aggressive, I will have security escort you out of the terminal. Do you want to fly today or not?" Behind her, a man in a bespoke navy suit cleared his throat. He was holding a leather briefcase and checking a Rolex. "Come on, lady," he muttered. "Some of us actually have work to do in London." Vivian turned to look at him. He was tall, silver-haired, and radiated the kind of unearned confidence that usually signaled a mid-level hedge fund manager. He stepped up to the podium. "Hi, Tiffany," the man said, flashing a charming grin. "Gregerson, Seat 2A." Vivian froze. She looked from the man to Tiffany. Tiffany beamed, her face flushing slightly. "Oh, Mr. Gregerson, yes, right this way. Thank you for your patience. Sorry about the obstruction." Vivienne blocked the path. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of an engineer spotting a structural crack. "Wait, you gave him my seat? Right now? In front of me?" "Mr. Gregerson is a Platinum Global member," Tiffany hissed, leaning over the podium. "And frankly, he fits the cabin profile. You do not now. Take your seat in 34E or I am calling the Air Marshal. This is your final warning." Vivienne looked at Mr. Gregerson. He offered her a pitying, dismissive wink. "Don't worry, sweetheart. The back of the bus gets there at the same time." He brushed past her, his expensive cologne clouding the air. Vivienne stood there for 3 seconds. She calculated the variables. If she argued, they would kick her off. She had to be in London for the summit. Her presentation on turbine blade shear stress was the opening keynote. If she missed it, the safety protocols she was fighting for might be delayed by months. She took the paper ticket. She looked Tiffany dead in the eye. "Make sure you log this interaction, Tiffany," Vivienne said softly. "You're going to need the documentation later." Tiffany laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "Next in line, please." Vivienne walked down the jet bridge. The tunnel felt like a throat swallowing her whole. The cold dampness of the rain outside seeped through the metal walls. She wasn't angry anymore. She was in recording mode. Every detail, every slight, every violation of protocol was being filed away in the steel trap of her mind. But as she stepped onto the plane, she realized the gate agent was just the warm-up act. The real problem was waiting at the door. The heavy door of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner stood open. Standing in the galley, greeting passengers with a plastic smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes, was the senior purser. His name tag read Brett. Brett was immaculate in his uniform. Every crease was sharp, his hair gelled into an immovable helmet. He was scanning passengers like a bouncer at a club, deciding who was worthy of eye contact and who was merely cargo. When Mr. Gregerson walked in, Brett practically bowed. "Mr. Gregerson, wonderful to see you again. Let me take that coat. We have the champagne on ice for you in 2A. "Thanks, Brett. Good to see you," Gregerson said loudly enough for the queue to hear. "Had a bit of a hold-up at the gate. Riff-raff, you know." "Say no more, sir. We'll keep the curtain closed tight." Then, Vivienne stepped through the door. She paused, just for a second, to inhale the scent of the cabin, recycled air, coffee, and aviation fuel. It was a smell she usually loved, the smell of her life's work. Today, it smelled like humiliation. Brett's eyes landed on her. His smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of active distaste. He looked at her hoodie, then down at the paper boarding pass in her hand. "Boarding pass," he demanded, extending a hand without looking at her face. Vivienne handed it to him. "There was a mix-up at the gate," she said, testing the waters. "I paid for 2A. They moved me to 34E. Brett laughed. It was a dry, incredulous sound. He held the ticket up between 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. "A mix-up, honey? People who look like you don't sit in 2A. The system corrects errors. You're in economy. Keep walking." "People who look like you." The phrase hung in the galley air, heavy and toxic. Vivienne felt a muscle in her jaw jump. "Excuse me?" "You're blocking the aisle," Brett said, his voice raising a decibel, designed to embarrass. "Economy is that way, past the curtain. Keep going until you hit the back wall, and try not to hit anyone with that bag." Vivienne tightened her grip on her satchel. "My name is Dr. Clark, and I expect to be treated with respect, regardless of where I am sitting." Brett leaned in closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of strong mints and arrogance. "Dr. Clark? What are you a doctor of? Internet scams? Listen to me. On this plane, I am the law. You are a passenger in the cheapest seat we have. If you give me 1 ounce of attitude, I will have you removed before the parking brake is released. Do we understand each other?" Vivienne stared at him. She saw the fear behind the bullying, the desperate need to control his little metal kingdom. She nodded slowly. "I understand you perfectly, Brett." She walked past him. The walk to row 34 was a gauntlet. She passed through the business class cabin. She saw Mr. Gregerson in her seat 2A. He had already kicked his shoes off and was sipping a flute of champagne, laughing at something on his phone. He didn't even look up as she passed. She passed the premium economy section. The seats got smaller. The air got warmer. Finally, she reached the economy cabin. It was chaotic. Families were struggling with overhead bins, babies were crying, and the air was thick with body heat. Row 34 was the second to last row. Seat E was the middle. Sitting in 34D aisle was a man who clearly hadn't showered in 2 days, already asleep with his mouth open, encroaching on her armrest. In 34F window was a teenager with oversized headphones, blasting techno music so loud Vivienne could hear the bass beat from the aisle. She stowed her bag under the seat in front of her. There was no room in the overhead bins. They were stuffed with the overflow from business class passengers who didn't want to check their bags. She squeezed into the middle seat, her knees pressed against the plastic tray table. She was 5'8", not tall, but the pitch was agonizing. She closed her eyes and tried to center herself. 42,000 feet, she told herself. Just get the bird in the air, get to London, file the complaint. But as the plane began its pushback, a sound cut through the noise of the crying baby in row 35. It was a sound 99% of people would ignore, a low, rhythmic whine thump coming from the left side of the aircraft. Vivienne's eyes snapped open. She knew that sound. She had written a paper on it 3 years ago. It was the hydraulic pump for the number 1 engine auxiliary line, specifically the check valve fluttering. It meant air was in the line. Or worse, the seal was degrading. She leaned forward, straining to hear. The thump came again. It was faint, but to her trained ear, it was screaming. She checked her watch. They were taxiing. She tapped the shoulder of the sleeping man next to her. "Excuse me." He snorted and grunted, shifting his leg but not waking up. Vivienne hit the call button. A minute passed. Nothing. The plane turned onto the active taxiway. The engines began to spool up for the pre-flight check. She hit the call button again and again. Finally, a flight attendant appeared. It wasn't Brett. It was a younger woman, looking harried and nervous. Her name tag said Sarah. "Yes, what is it?" Sarah asked, glancing at the call light. "We are about to take off. You need to be in your seat." "I am in my seat," Vivienne said, keeping her voice level. "Listen to me carefully. I am an aerospace engineer. Do you hear that thumping sound from the left wing?" Sarah blinked. "The engine noise. It's an airplane, ma'am. It makes noise." "Not that noise. It's a flutter in the hydraulic line. It's irregular. You need to tell the captain to check the yellow hydraulic system pressure before we throttle up." Sarah looked at Vivienne like she was crazy. She looked at the hoodie, the middle seat, the messy hair. "Ma'am, please put your phone away and fasten your seatbelt. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm telling you there is a mechanical fault." "Everything is fine," Sarah said dismissively, turning away. "Please relax. I need to speak to the senior purser," Vivienne insisted. "Get Brett." Sarah hesitated, then rolled her eyes. "Fine, but he's busy." 2 minutes later, as the plane held short of the runway, Brett came storming down the aisle. He didn't look concerned, he looked furious. He stopped at row 34 and loomed over her. "Sarah tells me you're causing a panic," Brett said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding 5 rows to hear. "Something about the engine exploding." "I didn't say exploding," Vivienne said, her engineering brain taking over. "I said the hydraulic check valve is fluttering. If you apply full takeoff thrust, you risk a pressure spike that could blow the line. You need to call the flight deck." Brett laughed. He actually laughed, turning to the passengers in the nearby seats. "Did you hear that, folks? The lady in 34E thinks she knows more than the pilots. She thinks she's a mechanic." A few passengers chuckled nervously. The teenager in the window seat pulled off his headphones to watch the show. "Look," Brett sneered, leaning down, his face inches from hers. "You're upset about your seat. I get it. You're acting out for attention. But if you delay this flight with your imaginary noises, I will have the police waiting for you in London. Now, for the last time, sit down, shut up, and enjoy the economy class service, which, for you, is nothing." He reached up and aggressively turned off her call light. "One more word," Brett whispered, "and I'm getting the zipties." Vivian went cold. She looked at the confident sneer on his face. She looked at the window. The plane began to turn onto the runway. The engines roared, the massive GE turbines spooling up to 90% N1. The thumping stopped. Because the pressure just maximized, Vivian thought with a jolt of terror. "It's holding. For now." The plane lurched forward, pinned back by the G-force. They were committed. As the wheels left the ground and the wing flexed upward, Vivienne gripped the armrests. She wasn't praying for herself. She was praying for the O-ring in the #1 hydraulic pump. Please hold, she thought, just for 10 minutes. But gravity, as Vivienne knew better than anyone, was a debt that always came due. The climb to cruising altitude was deceptively smooth. The Boeing 787 pierced through the storm clouds over the Atlantic, breaking out into the blinding, serene gold of the sunset above the weather. Inside the cabin, the fasten seatbelt sign chimed off. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the passengers. The tension of the storm was gone. Laptops were opened, shoes were kicked off, and the smell of reheating airline meals began to waft from the galleys. In first class, seat 2A, Mr. Gregerson was reclining all the way back. He had swapped his champagne for a scotch and was loudly recounting a golf story to the passenger across the aisle, a young influencer who looked desperate to put her headphones back in. "So I told the caddie," Gregerson boomed, "if you touch the iron, you lose the tip. Discipline, right? It's all about discipline." In the galley, Brett was preparing the drink cart for the main cabin. He moved with a haughty precision, snapping ice tongs and slamming drawers. He was still fuming about the interaction with the woman in 34E. The nerve, he thought, trying to scare passengers just to get a free upgrade. He made a mental note to accidentally run out of the chicken option by the time he reached her row. She would get the vegetarian pasta cold. Back in row 34, Vivienne sat motionless. She hadn't opened her book. She hadn't turned on the in-flight movie. She was staring at the back of seat 33E, her head cocked slightly to the left, listening. The hum of the engines was steady, but underneath the white noise, she could feel a vibration in the floorboards. It was a subtle, high-frequency tremor that traveled up through the soles of her sneakers. To anyone else, it was turbulence. To Vivienne, it was a harmonic dissonance. The pump she had heard earlier wasn't just fluttering anymore, it was cavitating, it was chewing itself apart. "Hey," the unwashed man in 34D grunted, nudging her elbow. "You gonna buy a drink?" "Cart's coming." Vivienne didn't look at him. "I wouldn't worry about the drinks." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means we aren't going to make it to London." The man rolled his eyes and turned away, muttering about crazy ladies. Brett reached row 10 with the cart. He was smiling, charming the passengers in economy comfort. He was in his element, the lord of the aisle. Then it happened. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a bang. It was a sound like a giant wet towel being snapped, followed instantly by a grinding screech that vibrated through the entire fuselage. The plane shuddered violently, yawing hard to the left. Coffee cups slid off tray tables. The unwashed man in 34D yelped as his soda splashed onto his lap. In the front, a flight attendant screamed as the drink cart lurched and slammed into a bulkhead. The plane corrected itself, but the smooth hum of the flight was gone. It was replaced by a guttural mechanical groaning. The cabin fell into a terrified silence. Then, the alarm started. Not in the cabin, but faint, muffled pings coming from the flight deck, audible only to those in the front rows. The PA system crackled. It wasn't the smooth, practiced voice of the pilot giving a tour guide speech. It was breathless, urgent. "Flight attendants, take your stations immediately. Verify cabin secure." Brett froze, a bottle of gin in his hand. His face went pale. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by the raw fear of a man who realized he was 35,000 feet in the air in a metal tube that was screaming. The plane banked again, this time sluggishly. The horizon line in the windows tilted at a sickening angle. Vivienne gripped the armrests. She closed her eyes and visualized the schematic of the 787's hydraulic architecture. Yellow system failure, she thought. The pump seized. It likely sheared the drive shaft. If the debris hit the crossover valve, we've lost the left system too. The teenager in 34F pulled his headphones off. What was that? Is the engine on fire? Vivienne looked out the window. No fire, she said calmly, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. We just lost hydraulic pressure. The controls are going to feel very heavy to the pilots right now. Are we gonna crash? The kid asked, his voice cracking. Not yet, Vivienne said, but we can't cross the ocean. We have to turn back. As if on cue, the plane began a wide, shuddering turn. The groan of the airframe grew louder. Up in first class, the scene was less composed. Mr. Gregerson had spilled his scotch all over his suit. What is going on? He shouted, standing up. Brett, get over here. Why is the plane shaking? Brett was strapped into his jump seat near the galley door, his knuckles white. He ignored Gregerson. He was staring at the interphone handset, waiting for the captain to call. The call came 10 seconds later. 3 sharp chimes, high priority. Brett unbuckled and grabbed the phone, his hand trembling. Cabin. Cabin secure, Captain. Brett, come to the flight deck, the captain's voice barked. Now. Brett hung up. He looked at the passengers staring at him, hundreds of eyes wide with fear, looking to him for reassurance. He had none to give. He walked up the aisle, past the spilled drinks and the terrified faces. He passed Mr. Gregerson, who grabbed his arm. I demand to know what is happening, Gregerson yelled. I am a platinum member. Brett ripped his arm away. Sit down and shut up, sir. He punched the code for the cockpit door. The heavy lock clicked and he stepped into the nerve center of the crisis. The cockpit of Flight 902 was a cacophony of organized chaos. Captain Miller, a veteran pilot with 30 years of experience, was wrestling with the yoke. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. The first officer, a younger man named David, was frantically flipping through the QRH Quick Reference Handbook, reading out checklists. The master caution light was flashing a rhythmic, angry yellow. The ECAS screen, engine indication and crew alerting system, was a Christmas tree of red and amber error messages. Hydraulic pressure left, low, David read out. Hydraulic pressure center degraded, slat actuator fault. Flight control mode, secondary. I can't get the trim to stabilize, Captain Miller grunted through gritted teeth. It feels like we're dragging a parachute. What's the status on the landing gear? Unknown, David said, his voice tight. The sensor is showing disagee. The gear might be down, it might be up, or it might be hanging halfway. If we try to land heavy with the gear only halfway locked. He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what that meant. If the gear collapsed on touchdown with a full fuel load, the friction sparks would turn the carbon fiber fuselage into an inferno before they even stopped sliding. Brett stood in the doorway, terrified. Captain, you asked for me? Captain Miller didn't turn around. Brett, listen to me. We have a catastrophic failure in the hydraulic distribution manifold. We're losing fluid fast. We need to dump fuel and return to JFK. But the fuel dump valves are on the same hydraulic loop that just failed. We are too heavy to land safely. Brett swallowed hard. What? What do you need me to do? I need to know if we hit something, Miller said, finally glancing back, his eyes wild. The sensors are giving us conflicting data. One says the pump exploded, the other says the intake was blocked. If it's a blockage, we might be able to bypass it and get the gear down. If it's an explosion, the lines are severed. Miller paused, staring at Brett. Did anyone see anything? Did you hear anything unusual during taxi? A bird strike? A noise? Brett opened his mouth to say no, to say everything was perfect. But the memory clawed its way up his throat. The woman in the hoodie. The check valve. The fluttering sound. He felt a wave of nausea. He had threatened to zip-tie the only person who had warned him. Brett! Miller shouted. Answer me? Did anyone report anything? Yes, Brett whispered. Speak up! Yes, Brett yelled, his voice cracking. A woman in economy, row 34. Before we took off. What did she say? She said. Brett struggled to recall the specific words he had dismissed as nonsense. She said the hydraulic check valve was fluttering. She said if we took off, the pressure spike would blow the line. Captain Miller and First Officer David exchanged a look of absolute shock. "A check valve flutter," David said. "That causes a harmonic resonance. That would explain why the sensors are confused. The vibration would shatter the sensor contacts before the pump actually failed." "Who is she?" Miller demanded. "Is she a mechanic?" I don't know," Brett stammered. "I thought she was just—" "Nobody. She's in the middle seat." "Get her up here," Miller ordered. "But Captain, regulations say—" "Screw the regulations," Miller roared, fighting the yoke as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. "If she knew exactly what that sound was, she knows the system better than the computer does. Bring her up here. Now." Brett stumbled out of the cockpit. The walk back to economy felt like a funeral march. The cabin was silent now, a heavy, suffocating silence. Passengers watched him pass, their eyes pleading for information. He ignored them. He walked past business class, past premium economy. He reached row 34. Vivian was sitting calmly, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as Brett approached. Her expression wasn't smug, it wasn't angry. It was the cold, hard look of someone who was waiting for the inevitable. Brett stopped at her row. He gripped the overhead bin to steady himself. He looked at the woman he had called riffraff, the woman he had humiliated. "Ma'am," Brett said, his voice trembling. Vivian didn't blink. "It's Dr. Clark." "Dr. Clark," Brett corrected, sweat dripping down his forehead. The captain would like to speak with you." The passengers in the surrounding seats gasped. The unwashed man in 34D looked at Vivian with wide eyes. Vivian didn't move. She just raised an eyebrow. "Oh, does he need advice from the cheap seats? I thought I was just acting out for attention." "Please," Brett whispered, and for the first time he looked like a human being. He looked like a man who knew he was about to die. "We can't get the landing gear confirmation. The pilots are. They're struggling. You were right. About the valve. Please." Vivienne unbuckled her seatbelt. The sound of the metal click was deafening in the quiet cabin. She stood up. She smoothed down her hoodie. She grabbed her satchel. "Move," she said to the man in the aisle seat. He practically dove out of her way. Vivienne stepped into the aisle and looked at Brett. "Lead the way, purser," and tried to keep up. The walk back to the front was different this time. As Vivienne walked down the aisle, heads turned. People didn't know who she was, but they saw the senior purser trailing behind her like a scolded puppy. They saw the authority in her stride. She passed through first class. Mr. Gregerson was clutching his empty glass, looking pale and sweaty. He looked up as Vivienne passed. "Hey," Gregerson shouted, his voice shrill. "Where is she going? Why is the economy trash going to the cockpit?" Vivienne stopped. She turned slowly to face him. The plane shuddered again, a violent kick that made the overhead bins rattle. Gregerson flinched. Vivienne leaned down, her face inches from his. "I'm going to save your life, Mr. Gregerson," she said, her voice ice cold. "Try not to spill your drink while I do it." She straightened up and walked through the cockpit door, Brett closing it softly behind her. Inside the flight deck, the noise was intense. The wind roar was louder here. Captain Miller turned his head. He saw the woman in the hoodie. He didn't sneer. He saw the way she scanned the instrument panel, her eyes darting immediately to the hydraulic pressure gauges, then to the slat indicators, then to the FMS, flight management system. "Dr. Clark?" Miller asked. "Vivian," she said, stepping forward and gripping the back of the pilot's seat. "You've lost the yellow system. Your center hydraulic isolation valve is stuck closed because of the debris from the pump failure. That's why you can't dump fuel. And that's why your gear won't lock." Miller stared at her. "How do you know the isolation valve is stuck?" "Because," Vivian said, pointing to a small, obscure dial on the overhead panel, "your heat exchanger is spiking. The fluid is trapped and boiling. If you try to force the gear down with the emergency gravity drop, the boiling fluid will blow the seals on the main struts. The gear will collapse the second we touch the tarmac." The cockpit went silent, save for the wind. "Okay," Miller said, his voice raspy, "so we can't land, and we can't dump fuel. What do we do?" Vivian looked at the complex array of switches. She looked at Brett, who was cowering in the corner. Then she looked at the captain. "We have to trick the system," she said. "We have to manually override the crossover logic. It's not in your manual, it's a test protocol we use in the wind tunnel." "Is it dangerous?" David asked. Vivienne smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile. "Oh, it's incredibly dangerous. If we get the timing wrong, we lose all flight controls and drop like a stone." She rolled up the sleeves of her hoodie. "Move over, David," she said to the first officer. "I need access to the secondary breaker panel." The first officer looked at the captain. Miller nodded. Vivienne Clark, the woman from seat 34E, squeezed into the jump seat behind the center console. She wasn't a passenger anymore. She was the engineer, and the fate of 300 souls was now resting in her hands. The atmosphere inside the cockpit was pressurized, both literally and metaphorically. Outside the reinforced windows, the Atlantic Ocean was a slate-gray sheet of death waiting below. Inside, the only sound was the frantic beeping of the altitude alerter and the sharp intake of breath from the crew. Dr. Vivienne Clark worked with the precision of a surgeon. She wasn't flying the plane. Captain Miller still had his hands white-knuckled on the yoke, but she was flying the machine. "Okay," Vivienne said, her voice cutting through the panic. "The 787 has a protection protocol called the load alleviation function. It prevents the hydraulic pumps from overpressurizing during turbulence. That's what's locking us out. The computer thinks the broken pump is a turbulence spike. So we turn it off." First Officer David asked, his hand hovering over the overhead panel. "No," Vivienne snapped. "If you turn it off, the remaining fluid in the center line will dump overboard. We need that fluid." She leaned forward, pointing to the circuit breaker panel behind the captain's left shoulder. "We have to fool the computer. We need to make it think we're on the ground." Captain Miller's head snapped around. "You want to engage ground mode while we're doing 280 knots at 10,000 feet? That will disable the stall protection. It'll deploy the spoilers. We'll fall out of the sky." "Not if we only do it for 3 seconds," Vivienne said, her eyes locked on Miller's. "Just enough time to pop the isolation valve open. Then we switch back to flight mode immediately. It forces a system reset. The valve opens, the pressure equalizes, and the gear comes down." "It's suicide," David whispered. "No," Vivienne corrected. "It's engineering, and it's your only option. We have fuel for maybe 20 more minutes of circling. After that, we're a glider. Decide." Miller looked at the fuel gauge. He looked at the red warning lights. He looked at Brett, who was huddled in the corner, praying silently. "Do it," Miller said. He tightened his grip on the yoke. "David, on my mark. You pull the air-ground logic breaker. Count to 3. Push it back in. Dr. Clark, you monitor the hydraulic pressure. If it spikes above 3,000 psi, tell us to abort or we blow the lines." "Understood," Vivienne said. She watched the digital needle on the center screen. "Ready," Miller shouted. 3, 2, 1, mark. David yanked the breaker. Instantly, the cockpit erupted in noise. The master warning siren screamed. The stick shaker activated, vibrating the control columns violently as the computer panicked, thinking the plane was sitting on the tarmac while simultaneously moving at 300 miles per hour. "Spoilers are deploying," Miller yelled, fighting the nose of the plane as it pitched down violently. "We're dropping." Sync rate is 4,000 feet per minute. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock. The ocean rushed up to meet them. 1. David counted, his voice trembling. The G-force slammed them into their seats. Vivienne fought the gravity, her eyes glued to the pressure gauge. It was climbing. 1,000 psi, 1,500 psi. 2. Pressure rising. Vivienne shouted over the alarms. "Come on, come on." The plane buffeted wildly. In the cabin behind them, screams could be heard even through the reinforced door. 3. Resetting. David jammed the breaker back in. The sirens cut off instantly. The spoilers retracted. The nose of the plane lurched up as the lift returned. For a second there was silence. Then a heavy mechanical thunk-clunk echoed through the floorboards, followed by the sweet, sweet sound of wind rushing over the landing gear doors. 3 greens, David shouted, pointing at the landing gear indicator. "Gear is down and locked. Pressure holding steady at 2,800 psi. Vivienne let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since the gate. She slumped back against the jump seat wall. The isolation valve opened. "You have brakes. You have steering." Captain Miller let out a laugh that sounded halfway between a sob and a cheer. He turned to look at Vivienne. The sweat was pouring down his face, but his eyes were filled with a profound respect. "Who did you say you were again?" Miller asked. "I'm the structural engineer who redesigned that valve assembly after the 2019 audit," Vivienne said quietly. "I told Boeing the solenoid was too sensitive. They didn't listen. Maybe they will now." "We're not down yet," Miller said, his voice returning to professional steel. "We're heavy, 40,000 pounds over max landing weight. We're going to come in hot. Dr. Clark, you better strap in. This is going to be rough." "I'll go back to my seat," Vivienne said, unbuckling. "No," Miller said firmly. "You stay here. If something else breaks on the way down, I want you right next to me." Vivienne nodded. She strapped into the jump seat. Brett, still pale as a ghost, looked at her. "Thank you," he mouthed. Vivienne didn't smile. "Don't thank me yet, Brett. Save it for the paperwork." JFK Airport had been cleared. The tower had diverted all other traffic. The runways were a ghost town, save for the flashing red and blue lights of 24 fire trucks and ambulances lining the tarmac like a guard of honor. Flight 902 was on final approach. From the cockpit window, the runway lights looked like a narrow string of pearls in the dark. "Speed 180, David called out. "Sync rate 800. "We're too fast," Miller muttered. "We have to keep the speed up or we stall with this weight. But if we hit the tarmac at this speed—" "The tires," Vivienne said. "The fuse plugs in the tires are rated for 220 miles per hour. We're close to the limit." "Brace for impact," Miller commanded over the PA system. In the cabin, the flight attendants shouted the drill. "Heads down, stay down, heads down, stay down." Mr. Gregerson in 2A was curled into a ball, his expensive suit ruined, weeping openly. In row 34, the unwashed man and the teenager were gripping each other's hands, strangers united by terror. The runway threshold flashed beneath them. Slam. The 787 hit the concrete with the force of a car crash. The struts compressed to their absolute limit, groaning under the massive weight of the fuel-laden aircraft. The plane bounced once, twice, then slammed down again. "Brakes, reversers," Miller shouted. The engines roared into reverse thrust. The sound was deafening. The plane shuddered violently as it fought to shed kinetic energy. Then came the pop, pop, pop. 3 of the main gear tires exploded instantly, unable to handle the friction and heat. The plane listed dangerously to the left, the bare metal rims grinding against the concrete. Sparks showered the night behind them, a kaleidoscope of orange fire. Left rudder, correcting. Miller fought the pedals, keeping the plane on the centerline. They were still moving at 100 knots. The end of the runway was approaching fast. "We're not stopping," David yelled. "Brake temperature is critical. Fire warning on the left bogie." "Keep it straight," Vivienne shouted. "Don't turn. If you turn, the gear collapses." The fire trucks were already racing alongside them, matching their speed, foam cannons ready. The plane screamed down the runway, metal screaming against stone. 80 knots, 60 knots, 40 knots. Finally, with a lurch that threw everyone against their harnesses, the beast came to a halt. For 10 seconds there was absolute silence. Then, the cockpit erupted with the voice of the tower controller. "Flight 902, fire observed on left main gear. Evacuate. I repeat, evacuate." "Evacuate! Evacuate! Evacuate!" Miller roared into the PA. Pandemonium, the slides deployed. Vivienne didn't wait. She was out of the jump seat, opening the cockpit door. "Go," she told the pilots. "Get out." She entered the cabin. It was thick with the smell of burnt rubber and fear. Brett was at the forward door, shouting instructions, pushing people down the slide. He looked efficient, but his eyes were manic. Vivienne waited. She didn't rush. She watched the families go. She helped the teenager from row 34 who had frozen in the aisle. When the plane was empty, she slid down the emergency chute, the friction burning her legs through her joggers. She landed on the tarmac. The cool night air hit her face. The sirens were deafening. Firefighters were blasting the landing gear with foam, burying the flames that licked at the belly of the plane. She stood up, brushing off her hands. She was alive. Passengers were huddled in groups on the grass, wrapped in silver emergency blankets, crying, hugging, calling loved ones. Vivienne stood a little apart, watching the fire crews work. She watched the plane she had just helped save. It looked wounded, leaning on its rim, covered in foam. "You." The voice was shrill. It was Mr. Gregerson. He came storming over, wrapped in a blanket, his face red with misplaced adrenaline. "You almost killed us," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Vivienne. "I saw you. You went into the cockpit. You distracted the pilots. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to sue this entire airline." A few passengers looked over, confused. "Sir," Vivienne said, her voice tired, "go sit down." "Don't tell me what to do." Gregerson yelled, "I know who you are. You're the economy scammer. You probably sabotaged the plane to get attention." He grabbed her arm. "Get your hands off her." The voice was deep and authoritative. Gregerson froze. He turned around. Standing there was a man in a dark trench coat, flanked by 2 armed police officers and a woman in a high-visibility vest that read NTSB-led investigator. But the man in the trench coat wasn't police. He was older, with silver hair and a face that was familiar to anyone who read the financial news. It was Arthur Sterling, the CEO of the airline. Sterling ignored Gregerson. He walked straight up to Vivienne. He looked at her hoodie. He looked at the soot on her face. "Dr. Clark?" Sterling asked. "Mr. Sterling," Vivienne nodded. "Your number 1 hydraulic pump has a manufacturing defect in the impeller shaft. I'd ground the entire 787 fleet if I were you, until the audit is done." Sterling let out a long breath. "Captain Miller radioed the tower," he said. "He said you saved the flight. He said without your override protocol, the gear would have collapsed." Gregerson's mouth dropped open. "What? Her? She was in row 34. She's a nobody." Sterling turned his gaze to Gregerson. It was a look of pure withering contempt. "A nobody?" Sterling repeated quietly. "Sir, Dr. Vivienne Clark is the lead consultant for the Federal Aviation Administration on composite structural integrity. She literally wrote the manual on the aircraft you just stepped off of." Gregerson stammered. I didn't know. The staff treated her like..." "Yes," Sterling said, his voice hardening. "We're going to talk about that." He gestured to the police officers. "Please escort Mr. Gregerson to the holding area. We need his statement regarding his disruptive behavior during the emergency." As Gregerson was led away, sputtering, Sterling turned back to Vivienne. "And Dr. Clark," Sterling said, "my car is waiting. I think we need to get you to London. But first, I believe there is a staff member you wanted to identify." Vivienne looked across the tarmac. She saw Tiffany, the gate agent, who had come out to see the drama, standing near the buses, and she saw Brett shivering near the ambulance. "Yes," Vivienne said, "I think it's time for a debrief." The VIP lounge at JFK's Terminal 4 was usually a place of hushed whispers and clinking crystal. Tonight, it was a courtroom. The room had been cleared of all other guests. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the flashing lights on the runway where the wounded 787 sat, surrounded by foam and fire trucks. Dr. Vivienne Clark sat in a leather armchair holding a glass of water. Her hands were shaking slightly. The adrenaline crash was finally hitting her. Across from her stood Arthur Sterling, the CEO. Next to him was Captain Miller, still in his sweat-soaked uniform, looking like he had aged 10 years in 2 hours. And standing by the door, flanked by security, were Tiffany, the gate agent, and Brett, the senior purser. Tiffany looked annoyed, checking her watch as if this were a minor inconvenience. Brett looked like a man walking to the gallows. He knew what the captain knew. "Let's be very clear," Arthur Sterling began, his voice low and dangerous. "We are hours away from a global press conference. The NTSB is already pulling the flight data recorder. But before the cameras turn on, I need to understand the human element." He turned to Captain Miller. "Captain, in your professional opinion, would we have made the runway without Dr. Clark's intervention?" Miller shook his head slowly. "No, sir. We were locked out of the system. We would have come in with the gear up. With that fuel load, it would have been a fireball. Everyone on board would be dead. Sterling nodded. He turned to Vivian. Dr. Clark, I have instructed our finance team to refund your ticket, obviously, and I'm arranging my personal Gulfstream to take you to London immediately. You will make your summit. Thank you, Arthur, Vivian said softly. But there is the matter of the ticket. Sterling frowned. The refund? No, the original seat. Vivian set her water down. She turned her gaze to Tiffany. I booked seat 2A, full fare, 3 weeks ago. When I arrived at the gate, I was told there was a system error, and I was moved to 34E. My seat was given to Mr. Gregerson. Sterling turned slowly to Tiffany. Is this true? Tiffany straightened her blazer, forcing a smile. Sir, the system was flagging her reservation. She looked, well, she didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger. I made a judgment call to prioritize a platinum member to avoid a delay. I was protecting the brand. Protecting the brand, Sterling repeated, tasting the words like sour milk. And, Tiffany added, gaining confidence, she was aggressive. She was holding up the line. I followed standard de-escalation protocol. Vivienne reached into the pocket of her hoodie. She pulled out her phone. I have a habit, Vivienne said, tapping the screen. When I conduct safety audits, I record everything. It's an occupational hazard. She pressed play. Tiffany's voice, tinny but clear, filled the silent lounge. Frankly, he fits the cabin profile. You do not. Now take your seat in 34E or I am calling the air marshal. Then came the sound of Mr. Gregerson's laughter. Don't worry, sweetheart. The back of the bus gets there at the same time. Tiffany went pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Profiling, Sterling said, his face darkening to a furious shade of red. You profiled a world-renowned engineer because she was wearing a hoodie? You violated federal ticketing laws and insulted a passenger to impress a hedge fund manager? I didn't know who she was, Tiffany stammered. That is exactly the point, Sterling shouted, making everyone jump. You treat everyone with respect because you don't know who they are. That woman in the hoodie was the only person capable of saving that plane. Sterling turned to the security guard. Escort her out. Take her badge. You are fired, effective immediately. And you will be facing a formal inquiry regarding discriminatory practices. Tiffany was led out, weeping loudly, her heels clicking on the marble floor for the last time. Sterling turned his attention to Brett. Brett was trembling. He couldn't look Vivian in the eye. And you, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. Captain Miller tells me that Dr. Clark identified the mechanical fault before takeoff. Is that correct? Brett swallowed hard. Yes, sir. And she reported it to you? Yes, sir. And what did you do? Brett remained silent. Tears were streaming down his face. Vivian spoke up. He told me to shut up. He told me I was acting out for attention. He threatened to zip-tie me if I pressed the call button again. Captain Miller stepped forward, his fists clenched. You threatened a passenger who was reporting a safety hazard? Brett, that is criminal negligence. If you had called me, if you had just picked up the phone, we would have returned to the gate. We wouldn't have taken off. We wouldn't have risked 300 lives. I thought she was crazy. Brett cried out. She was in the middle seat. She was dressed like a scrub. How was I supposed to know? You listen, Vivian said, standing up. She walked over to Brett. She didn't look like a scrub now. She looked like a giant. A plane doesn't care if you're wearing a tuxedo or sweatpants. Gravity doesn't care about your frequent flyer status. The machine respects physics, not your ego. You were so busy judging me that you didn't hear the plane screaming at you. Brett fell to his knees. It was a pathetic sight. The man who had been a tyrant in the galley was now a puddle on the floor. Please, Brett sobbed. I've been with the airline for 15 years. I have a mortgage, please. Sterling looked at him with zero sympathy. You are fired, Brett, but it's worse than that. I am personally filing a report with the FAA to revoke your certification. You will never work on an aircraft again, not even to serve peanuts. Sterling waved his hand. Get him out of my sight. As Brett was dragged out, he looked back at Vivian, his eyes pleading. She just turned away and looked out the window at the flashing lights. The door closed. The silence returned. "Justice is served," Sterling said, adjusting his cufflinks, "though it feels inadequate." "It's a start," Vivian said. She picked up her bag. "Now, if you don't mind, Mr. Sterling, I have a presentation to give in London. I need to explain to the world why your hydraulic pumps are failing." Sterling winced. "Go easy on us." Vivian smiled, and for the first time it was a genuine, warm smile. "I'm an engineer, Arthur. I stick to the facts, but I might mention that your pilots are excellent." She nodded to Captain Miller. Miller saluted her. A true salute, from one professional to another. Dr. Vivian Clark made it to the London summit just in time. She walked onto the stage in her hoodie. She hadn't had time to change, and received a standing ovation. Her speech changed the safety protocols for the 787 globally. Tiffany couldn't find another job in customer service. The video of her meltdown went viral. Brett is currently working in a warehouse, safely on the ground. And Mr. Gregerson? He was banned from the airline for life. He tried to sue, but dropped the case when the airline threatened to release the cockpit audio of him screaming. The next time Vivienne flew, she walked up to the gate. The new agent smiled at her, scanned her ticket and said, "Right this way, Dr. Clark, seat 2A. Vivienne smiled back. "Thank you. And do me a favor, listen to the machine. Talk about a turbulence you didn't see coming." In the end, the very person they mocked for sitting in economy was the only one qualified to save their lives. It's a brutal reminder that arrogance isn't just rude, it can be deadly. Tiffany and Brett learned the hard way that you should never judge someone by their appearance, because you never know who you're actually talking to. Dr. Clark didn't need a first-class ticket to prove her worth. She proved it by doing the one thing they couldn't, saving the day. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And I want to know, have you ever been judged or mistreated by staff while traveling? Tell me your flight from hell story in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story. We upload new drama every week. Thanks for watching. Fly safe, and remember, respect is the only currency that matters.